Yabba Dabba Doo and Ibudan 2. It's Southpaw Deep Space 9. Welcome, everybody. This is the show where fight nerds come to learn how to be regular nerds, in that I, Angel Marti, take my co-host, Southpaw Sam, into a journey of discovery with Star Trek Deep Space Nine, going episode by episode, of viewing, deconstructing, analyzing, and enjoying, hopefully. If you notice anything about my voice in this episode compared to last episode, I am getting a little bit back, getting over a cold that I got while I was visiting a friend in Seattle. Word of advice for viewers: don't visit Seattle in the winter if you don't have like an immune system made out of iron, and I certainly don't. And I'm a spoiled son baby from who lives in Los Angeles. Sam, how are you this week?
I'm good. I'm kind of liking this voice. It sounds like very like AM gold, like, late night radio, where it's a soothing, like whispery voice before you play some love songs or something.
I have had multiple people tell me they prefer that they like this rasp. You're listening to Delilah. And well, we'll see. We'll see. Viewers, leave feedback. If you prefer sexy cold voice Angel, I will just make sure I lick a public payphone before every episode, so I'm always sick.
This is our special ASMR episode.
Oh my God, yes. I'm going to be just like crunkling. Crunkling is when Lil Jon does ASMR.
Okay.
Crinkling tissue paper and stuff during the episode. So for those of you who might already be familiar with the episode order, we're actually going by the Netflix episode order, which is a little bit out of sync with what Memory Alpha has, which is like the authoritative wiki for Star Trek, and what it is on Paramount Plus. So the episode we are doing today is actually going to be A Man Alone, which was the second in the production order after the pilot of Emissary. And Sam, do you have any initial thoughts for this episode that you want to talk about up top before we go into a blow-by-blow plot analysis?
Yeah, maybe this is more also the inverse of not just fight nerds getting used to Star Trek fandom and lore, but also Star Trek nerds learning to analyze Star Trek like it's pro wrestling commentary or, fight play-by-play, something like that. So it's going to be a merging of worlds like Star Trek Generations.
So is Kirk or Picard pro wrestling in that analogy? No, that's an easy question. Kirk is pro wrestling. Like, I mean, he there are so many great episodes of TOS where he literally throws a drop kick and a flying crossbody. He does hit a flying crossbody on an Andorian in one episode. I think it was because Shatner trained with Gene LaBelle, and that was back in the 60s when they still treated wrestling like it was a real martial art. So
yeah,
in my head canon, Gene decided Shatner was a mark he could work and taught him like moves that he taught him a flying crossbody like it was a real fighting move.
Well, most of his moves, right, were basically moves Hulk Hogan had, like especially the double axe handle and the jumping double axe handle.
Yes, there was a lot of double axe handles in the Kirk Fu fighting system.
So as far as this episode goes, my initial feeling was like, it's, I don't know what it would have been like if I watched it in the order that, is in canon, but watching this right after Emissary, which was long and very heavy and, it felt very much like a cinematic event. This was like a nice change in tone and pace because it was like the first one where, okay, now it's like an episodic, like this is like more comfortable. Now we're getting started. This is what like future episodes will look like. There's like a mini plot for this, and then there's like an overarching plot that will carry us through the series and the season. But also it felt like world building, like, oh, you're dropping some stuff that's going to happen here that'll seems like fixtures of the show. It was a nice change of pace from the intensity of Emissary, which was, very intense, just plot wise, but emotionally, like I watched it with my wife, and even she had never seen any Star Trek before. Was like, damn, that one got to me because she was like, at the end, she's like, oh, I have a lot of like trauma that I'm always living in, that I'm choosing to live in, and it's like, oh, the trauma isn't making me be there. It's like I don't want to get like self helpy, but she felt like she could do a lot for herself by letting go of a lot of these things.
Well, maybe we could do a spin-off podcast where we basically run like a self-help MLM, but it's based in Star Trek. As this episode, A Man Alone, opens, there is something brewing in Dr. Bashir's pants. Because whenever I watch early Deep Space Nine, specifically season 1, anytime Dr. Bashir appears on screen, I like to just announce out loud to the empty room, and now for the adventures of Dr. Horny! Because every moment, like, I'm not going to spoil too much, but we do see some evolution in Dr. Bashir's character. But definitely the first few times you meet him, like, he is the most incel-y, character that like ever incelled an incel. And so we open here with I don't want to just dismiss him as an incel, but it's just like very clear that like any woman that hoves into his view that he views as like intellectually fascinating or like, charming in any way, he very clearly develops romantic feelings to. So we open with him very, uh, very awkwardly, but not shyly, flirting with Dax as she does an Altonian brain teaser, which is some kind of like space Simon because it involves like all of these patterns and colors.
How much of that persona do you think is just part of the times? Like, as far as like 90s TV writing, like humor, like how much of this was just like, this is how you made funny characters, because it seems like a lot of Star Trek this era relies a lot on like tropes and like, almost like alien species, racial profiling, or even like with women, there's lines about like, how women are, a lot of these type of hammy stereotypes for jokes.
Yeah, I mean, like again, I feel like because we're set again on this static setting, of a space station, there are some elements of Deep Space Nine that sort of both choose to and are allowed to be a little bit more reminiscent of like a sitcom, in the sense of like, I mean, yeah, you're right. At this, this is also, uh, I like 93 was also kind of like the golden age of like sitcoms that were mostly about relationships, or like, because, you had Seinfeld, Friends, Mad About You. So I would, and this was on UPN at the time. I'm trying to remember like what sitcoms were on UPN at the time, but I really the only thing that I watched on UPN was Star Trek when it still existed, and SmackDown. So I can't remember
Yeah.
what else was on. Well, it's also interesting in the reverse of like, let's say on The Next Generation, where you had the chief medical officer on the Enterprise D was mostly experiencing romantic tension with Captain Picard, except that one episode where she fucks a ghost. But that's a golden nugget of Star Trek if you haven't seen that one. But also, so it's like we have Bashir, instead of being, he's a chief medical officer of Deep Space Nine, but instead of being this like mother, sort of older and nurturing and mature, he's a young, swaggering, horny braggart. And I think that might have been one of the different way. There are many things about Bashir that sort of that are helpful, I think, especially early on in the show, to be like, this ain't your daddy's Star Trek, and like, this isn't the Enterprise, and we don't have very subtle, sort of energy between Doctor Crusher and Picard. That's like, our doctor fucks. So one of the things that we notice about Jadzia in this scene already is that wow, is she infinitely patient? Or the fact that she's lived so many lifestyles and lives, as she definitely is more open and accepting of and less awkward around things like sexuality and attraction and romance, I think, because we definitely have a different energy between like Kira and Bashir versus Dax and Bashir, even though both of them are not interested in him romantically or sexually. Dax definitely just seems to have a much more uh, gentle and less irritated response to his energy than Kira does, and I think that's going to be reflected in her attitude with a lot of other characters too. So we actually end that scene with Cisco showing up and picking up Dax to go to dinner. And then after the opening credits, we move to the scene with Odo in the bar.
It's definitely playing going back and forth between Odo and Dax because Odo then also talks about relationships, going back to your previous comments about 90s and maybe, Star Trek Deep Space Nine is trying to be a show for everybody, something for everyone, right? So in dealing with relationships, Odo talks about himself as a man. Then he talks about she and how couples, and she, like as in women can, be bothersome or tiring when Odo has no actual gender. And there's a conversation then about Dax and her gender fluidity, I think, with Cisco. So whether consciously or unconsciously, the show is already raising questions about essence versus the body, which will be interesting if later on Cisco or the show like explores more about the spiritual side of like you are not necessarily your body.
Yeah, we definitely have a contrast about like different aspects on relationships because so we see that the dinner that they're going to is really basically Cisco and Jadzia's first conversation and Cisco really getting to know the new host of the Dax symbiont since the death of Curzon, who was his old friend and mentor. So this is like one of the things that establishes that Dax carries on the memories and a lot of the consciousness, a lot of things from Curzon, while still being like her own person. But there is a lot of fluidity there, as you say, and that's why Dax was sort of before. I mentioned it last week, but Star Trek Discovery now has like actual, in the text trans and non-binary characters. But this was what establishes Dax as sort of being an entry point for a lot of trans and uh, gender non-conforming people, as finding a lot of their early access point for a character with any kind of experience similar to them. And I believe, in fact, there was like a gay, I don't remember the name of it, but there was like some like gay culture magazine in, at the time the show was on, that did an article specifically about Dax.
In the previous episode with Emissary, we saw that procedure where the
The symbiont, yeah.
goes over to the new host. So that wasn't then like a mind takeover. It wasn't like the symbiont like taking over the mind and the body of the host. It's like they kind of share a consciousness. How does that work?
Yeah, yeah. It's like a joined trill is a joined person. Like they simultaneously keep the most of the like the dominant personality is that of the host, so Jadzia. But I guess it's really just the memories is a good way to sort of summarize what it is that the symbiont carries from the previous host, because like this I don't remember, but it's like for example, like Jadzia might know how to play piano, but that's not just because Curzon knew how to play piano, but like Curzon, um, this isn't like too spoiler, but just like Curzon ends up revealed as like being very close to spending a lot of time around Klingons, so Jadzia conveniently has a lot of knowledge of Klingon culture. That doesn't spoil any particular plot, but that's just something that comes in later. But so that's kind of how it's treated. It's like Jadzia Dax is a different person from Curzon Dax, as who was a separate person from Emily Dax, who the previous host, and who was a separate person from. There, actually, as a nice preview, pretty soon in this season there will be an episode that sort of like has Jadzia confronting aspects of all of her previous hosts. So stay tuned for that one.
So this is kind of a contrast to the Borg, where it's also a symbiotic relationship, but the Borg just completely take you over.
Oh yeah.
Whereas this isn't a takeover; it's more of a sharing, but the host really still maintains control.
Yeah, if anything, this is the actual fulfillment of what the Borg promise, which is to say, they always say your biological and technological distinctivenesses will be added to our own. But really what happens is that just you become biologically and technologically homogenized. Capitalism. But here it's like joining of a symbiont with a trill host is like actually like a mutually enriching. It is a symbiosis and not an assimilation.
It's mutual aid. It's communism.
Yes, exactly. But then we see that Quark and Odo are observing a discordant interaction between Chief Miles O'Brien and his wife, Keiko. I must say, in Star Trek fandom, there's a lot of discourse around Keiko. So also, she is another character that was first introduced on The Next Generation, but, she wasn't given a lot of development there. So really, this was a lot of people's first real meeting of Keiko.
Yeah, I think Keiko is a good arc to show how Asian American expectations of representation has changed over time. Because back then, I remember even Asians who didn't watch Star Trek or didn't care were just excited to see somebody Asian, on TV. Whereas now, people who don't watch Star Trek, Asians who don't watch Star Trek, are not going to mention her anymore because now she is more of like the typical trope of the Asian wife to the white dude, right? So it shows like the expectations have moved from there where that was okay just because any representation was good, even if it wasn't the greatest representation. Whereas now it's not something like Asians are going to flex as something they're proud of.
Yeah, this was before the internet taught us to have an instant squicky vibe from white guys married to Asian women. But it is. So she was first introduced as Keiko Ishikawa on the Enterprise D, because on the Enterprise, she was a civilian botanist, because the Enterprise was the kind of place where you could do that because you were exploring strange new worlds. And she gets married, becomes Keiko O'Brien. And then before, they're actually, her wedding to Miles is shown in the episode entitled Data's Day, where the actually like one of the parts of the A plot is Data getting ready to figure out how to deliver a speech at their wedding. So just from the get go, she's kind of an auxiliary to help develop to help us develop male characters. But at least, I mean, it is interesting because we do see her, especially in this episode, be more like central to a plot, even though it is not the a plot, but it is about her, like, you're right, being a nagging wife, being eventually, like going from like us being a scientist to being a teacher, out of concern for the children on the station. So it's a very typical, mother-like nurturing role. So there's definitely pluses and minuses to the whole character, both as a product of its time and just in general.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, as well as our private chat group on Discord. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
And how much of this was just also a way to introduce the plot of a school?
There could have been a lot. There are a lot of things that they sort of do right, by Keiko with the writers because they could have very much just forgotten Keiko, but they decided not to because they realized it was more interesting to have the story of how do we deal with somebody who moved for the sake of their marriage for the sake of their spouse's career, because that's also a thing that a lot of women have had to deal with. So on the one hand, it sucks that they depict, a woman having to sacrifice, her main career passion for the sake of her husband. But on the other hand, that's probably something a lot of viewers related to. And it just hit me as you were talking about, like, why would they need to justify having a school? And I was like, oh, right. What's another thing that you often see in any kind of Old West town is the school marm, having to make sure that the school children don't get caught in the, in the shootouts. I didn't even think about that, but that is, I don't even know if that, again, I don't even know out and out if that was intentional. I'll have to look into it, but it does make a lot of sense. So it is them taking something that was already there that was convenient to them to continue this frontier, Wild West frontier analog.
Yeah, there's nothing written about her that has to be Asian. She just happens to be, right? But she is more living up to this type of old Western trope, even to the point of she's the school marm who loves flowers. That is very much a thing if you've ever watched those Little House on the Prairies type shows, right? So
yeah, it could be worse. She could be the Asian on Deep Space Nine with a pig farm where they store the dead bodies. It could have been Space Deadwood like that. But then in the midst of all this, we see a mysterious Bajoran man in Quark's bar playing Dabo, and Odo immediately recognizes him and starts to rough him up and say that he can't be on the station anymore. So it turns out that the man who showed up is named Ibudan, which I will say personally is the most fun name to say of any Star Trek character, because I keep saying it to myself the whole time I watch this episode. Ibudan. But apparently he was a man who lived on board Deep Space Nine during the Cardassian occupation when it was called Terok Nor. And he was somebody who smuggled medical supplies and black market goods to Bajor. And Odo notes that some people consider him a hero, but he sees him as a ruthless profiteer and, of course, a troublemaker, which is the biggest sin to Odo. So now this, now we're really this is some meat we can chew on, I think, as leftists analyzing this in modern times.
Well, what I also noticed just 2 episodes in is there's the main plot and conflict, but also a philosophical question. Emissary did that. It had a plot, it had this conflict, but it asked these philosophical questions about time and experience, right? Whereas this episode, it has that as the main plot, but then it also asks the philosophical question about justice. What is justice? But they're playing to that binary of mob justice versus some, Supreme Court kind of US law and order type of justice. But I don't remember which character, but they do bring up that justice is subjective based on the context of the culture and the situation.
Because the captain of Deep Space Nine is a black man, he does not take kind to security just randomly roughing people up, I would say. Again, this is definitely, well, I was about to say this is definitely me sort of backwardsly projecting, our modern critical view of the police onto this. But this was 1993. This was not, that far far from Rodney King and the LA riots. I think definitely there was a critical eye on the police, even at this moment, and this benefit. I think, wow, okay, this is, I love how readdressing stuff that I watched as a kid is now letting me bring so much up, because I'm thinking that this actually benefited from it being in 1993 before the post 9/11 beatification of the police along with firefighters, because this was before we had to respect all cops as they're our first responders, but this was around the time of the LA riots, and people were thinking, maybe police abuse is a thing. So to get back to the actual show, so Cisco's like, what are you doing? Let me see if I can do it. Especially with my cold voice, maybe I can really do the Commander, laws change depending on who's making them. Cardassians one day, Federation the next. But justice is justice. And as long as I'm in charge of security, and Cisco says, if you can't work within the rules, I'll find someone who can. So Odo definitely tries to position himself as the arbiter of justice, even though, his role is institutional.
Are his clothes a part of his body?
Oh yeah. He definitely sometimes there are little gag scenes that help explain how a character works, and I can't remember which episode but it's not a major plot spoiler. But there's another scene in another episode where he talks about how he sometimes will make part of himself to form a mug, so he can because it's established that he doesn't need to eat or drink, but in order to fulfill the social obligation, to sort of perform the expected pantomime of being a humanoid.
Passing.
Yeah, he'll make himself appear to be drinking coffee out of a mug, but it's him just making part of himself look like a mug, and then making part of himself fill the mug with a liquid. And so wearing clothes, and wearing a uniform, and just even having hair, all of his mannerisms, and a lot of his you could say that most of his personality is, and you put it right, trying to pass. It is performance.
I mean, he even said that, I believe, either in this episode or in Emissary. He literally says the term passing, that he's passing as, one of them, or, but he doesn't know who he is. But one thing I appreciated about Deep Space Nine and this character is, even though he could do all those amazing things, at least up to this point, he doesn't seem super strong. I totally expected when he was trying to rough up people, he could just lift them over his head and throw them with one hand, which typically is the alien trope in Star Trek, but he didn't seem like Klingon strong, or any stronger than a human.
Yeah. Vulcans are very strong, although they try not to use their strength. I think, again, the writers were very, I will say this very often, but I think, the writers were very competent about what makes a show interesting. And that means don't overpower, characters. And so, yeah, there's limitations on Odo's shape-shifting ability. He can't make anything with a, more or less mass than him. He can just change his volume, but not his mass. And yeah, he can't turn himself into a machine or something. So yeah, he's not super strong. It's shape shifting is his deal. And, he has other weaknesses besides. Also, they give him this, which comes into play in this episode. He has to revert to a liquid state periodically. He can only hold a solid shape for so long.
It sounds very much like when you're playing some kind of role-playing game, you have to think about power scale and game balance.
Right. For example, Jadzia, again, she has all the memories of how to, of the Klingon martial arts that Curzon learned, but her strength is constrained by the body of Jadzia Dax, who is, still young and healthy, but not super strong. So they definitely, we don't have a bunch of Superman, planet killer characters in this, because part of this might be just my creative opinion, because I've been conditioned by shows like this and Babylon 5, but the flaws are what make the characters interesting. So after Odo makes that very cryptic remark about justice is justice, and getting admonished by Cisco to work within the rules, we then see that Ibudan is getting a massage in a holosuite And then he gets stabbed.
Now it's a forensic show.
Yeah, I know. Now we've got a murder mystery.
No, actually, it does become a forensic show, right? With Bashir coming in later doing a little bit of crime investigation.
Yeah. So then we go to commercial. I remember actually liking commercial breaks because that was when I would go to pee. And now I just like, when do I pause? Jake and Nog are friends now, but Nog is a bad influence, and he gets Jake to like harmlessly poison some couple's food, so they start turning neon colors. That one part of me thinks like, oh, they say it's like a harmless prank, but part of me just imagines them in sickbay, like just having some like very awful genetic like level after effects afterwards that we don't see. But here's where Keiko is like, these boys need a school, which I mean, she does it in a way that like Rosalind Chow, definitely tries her damnedest to make sure that Keiko is seen as like that the energy coming off of Keiko isn't just nagging, but like she cares. She chooses to do this not because she feels like a need to go on an authority trip, but it's like she wants to see these kids develop. It is like the lack of support for children on the station is like a circumstance of it being, initially a purely military installation run by the Cardassians. And, that it is a way she brings up the Enterprise. And it is actually, very, again, it's very smart and useful that it like, contrast the setting of Deep Space Nine from the setting of the Next Generation. That, again, it's a much more cold, barren, less welcoming, less kind world that they're trying to make so, in the aftermath of its occupation. And so it is Miles' idea that she open a school. So you again, after all of that, we are then left to wonder, it's like, well, why is that Miles' first reaction? Like, oh, you know what my wife should do? She should be a teacher. But I guess it works out.
It's one of those like husbands looking for something for their wife to do with their free time. Oh, why don't you do this?
Why don't you join a knitting circle?
Yeah.
By the way, has it been made clear to you now that people definitely fuck in these holosuites, Sam?
That was I think the Next Generation really, they never like showed that, did they? But they always seem to imply that, a lot of times people use this kind of like porn room.
Well, on the Next Generation, there was definitely much more like, oh, the holodeck is like a playground, like a theme park, you use to be a cowboy or Sherlock Holmes. And I think this is where, like, I mean, clearly, people were like, yeah, if we had holodeck technology, people would use it to fuck. Because, I mean, even at this point, we've already seen how the major innovator, the first wave of innovation of any mode of technology, of entertainment technology, it's always porn. I mean, porn helped develop the VHS. It helped develop the internet. So it is definitely a very, and now, we like, there's plenty of VR porn already. We're on our way to that. So again, this is like definitely like past becoming prologue. Like the future looking backwards ends up just like forecasting. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's a more efficient way to put it. But there is an episode later where Quark just offers somebody, like, if they a trip to a holosuite is like, do you want a free session on holosuite? Does your species have sex? So it's like Deep Space Nine was definitely like this. This was where they were like, okay, we're gonna stop like wink nudging about it and just say like, yeah, this is like what it's for.
But on the station, you have to pay to use the holodeck?
I guess I think we touched upon it briefly in the last episode, but it is never fully explained where the Federation officers on the station get their money to pay, or if they have. I think either this is how it's supposed to work, or this is just the most logical headcanon that has come out after the fact. But I think the like Starfleet officers living on Deep Space Nine don't have to pay for like rent or like their basic needs of survival, since it is a Starfleet installation.
Or the holodeck, huh?
I think so. Or within the case of Quark, since he's not like he's like an outside businessman. I think outside businesses that are not like Federation operated or operated by Federation members can like lease space on the station. They pay rent to the Federation somehow. It's very nebulous because I think this is one of the things where it's like Star Trek was created by Gene Roddenberry, who, by the account of his late wife Majel Barrett Roddenberry, she said at a convention before her death that Gene did identify as a communist, specifically in the model of China. So I guess he was like, a pro Black Panther Maoist, but because he was writing in America in the 60s during the Cold War, and because it then subsequently became, the franchise property of NBC and then Paramount Pictures, and Star Trek never was going to come out and say that the Federation was socialist. It's not a thing that was going to happen if it was going to be anything that had the staying power that it has. Obviously, there's a lot of subtext, and there is text. Like Picard says in First Contact, money doesn't exist in the 24th century. Kirk says it in in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. So even before Deep Space Nine was on the air, he does mention to a 20th century, civilian that money doesn't exist where he comes from. So it's established that money doesn't exist within the Federation, within Starfleet. But obviously there is some kind of exchange that exists as far as like, between Starfleet, between the Federation and other interstellar states and economies. In summary, it's like they never fully explain how money works on Deep Space Nine. So there will be a lot of contradictions, both within Deep Space Nine and between different works of Trek.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of money, like I just released a 6-parter about personal finance. Like, just because you're writing about sci-fi, there's some stuff you should leave a mystery because you just won't understand it well enough to ever do the world building for that. And money, these writers, there's just no way they will understand how money works in the future because they don't even understand how money works now. I mean, just going off of basic economic understandings and rules about like, we don't even have to go into Marx. It could just be even under a capitalist paradigm. Once you have something like a replicator and a holodeck, it becomes a game changer because the whole idea of money is like you have to have some kind of scarcity. So you have to have some kind of ledger system to figure out, limited goods. But if things are no longer limited, then you no longer need money. Like if the replicator existed in this world, our economy would collapse. It's just like how they said, if there's like a meteor that is made of gold that crash lands here, it would destroy our economy because there would just be now too much gold in the world, right? So, I think they just came up with two different ideas, replicators and then no money. But one actually leads to the other. When you have replicators, you can't have money. With that said, with the holodeck and replicators like that, you could have gatekeeping where it's still physical things that are inaccessible to everybody. So then people who have access to that can live in this space communism where there is no money, but people who are outside of that system still have to use some kind of exchange system. Whether the writers understood this or not, I think them not explaining it too much still allows for room for people like me to read into it.
Right.
If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room. Not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
Before we get to that, the next spin-off, Southpaw DS9 economics, we discover the real scandal at the center of this plot, which is they investigate Ibudan's dead body. They investigate the scene where he was murdered. They find no DNA evidence of anybody being in that holosuite except Ibudan. And then they find that the door to the holosuite was only opened twice, when Ibudan entered and when his killer left. And then they investigate his ship, and they find that Ibudan had a meeting with Odo scheduled before he was killed. Odo himself says the only way that there could have been no DNA left and there could have been somebody who left without entering would be if the killer had been a shapeshifter like him, who was able to get in through the cracks of the door, like Ivan Ooze.
Well, it also shows Odo is very principled, even though he basically throws himself under the bus. Because his sense of justice is so strong, he still has to do it.
Yes, he does say in his own words that it is a very neat package that that all of this evidence is there to frame him. Kira asks him if he has an alibi, and like I mentioned before, he doesn't, because his alibi is that during the time of the murder, he was in his liquid state in a bucket. So there's no way he could say like, I was regenerating, but it's like, oh, if you were in a liquid state, you could have very easily been able to slide through the door. Also, I think it bears noting, just in general for the context for people who might not be aware, at this point, both in the show and in Star Trek in general, we don't know what Odo's species is, and we don't know how it works. So him saying that he has to regenerate every 18 hours could, both to any of the viewers, could very much have just been, something made up. And he sort of realizes that's why it doesn't really work as an alibi. After the news of Ibudan breaks out, we have Bajorans on Deep Space Nine starting to doubt whether or not Odo is innocent and he was framed. It seems like Deep Space Nine, at least everybody in the crew accepts from the get-go that Odo was framed, because they all, being his coworkers, trust him implicitly. But the Bajorans on the station are not as confident, especially because it is revealed that Odo was a security officer. Well, actually, no, it was revealed. It was said as much in Emissary as well, but it comes into play here. Odo was a security officer on the station during the Cardassian occupation. He worked for the Cardassians. There is no reason why anybody who's not like his closest coworkers should trust that he wasn't willing to just kill a former member of the Bajoran resistance. And just as a personal opinion, I sort of think it's a bit of a plot hole that Kira doesn't hate him, for the same reasons at the beginning of the show. I mean, like, obviously she doesn't like him, but it's like, I am surprised that she's not as aggressively. I mean, again, maybe that's just her trying to be professional, but I always thought myself that Kira probably should be very much in the same camp.
Knowing what we know now, it very much seemed like her and Odo were on a team against Cisco and the Federation, right? Especially in the first episode. But then finding out that he was on the opposite side of her, and it's like, wait, why are you two on the same side? So I don't know. Going forward, I guess it'll become less of an issue because you just expect them as a crew to get along. But I think especially at the beginning, it's more glaring, right? That kind of getting along and getting together should be part of the story arc.
Right. You know, like now it's like where there are a lot of different layers being added on to how we view Odo in this episode, because it's like now not only does he seem to have a bit of a vigilante streak to him, but like also like he's a Nuremberg defense case. Like he probably was like views it as just following orders, that he worked for the Cardassians of all people.
Well, to further complicate it more, there's also a narrative that was played upon in the first episode and also with this one, that he's like basically the ultimate minority on Bajor, and also an immigrant, because there's only one of him. He's not from there, right? So there's also this outcasted minority angle to Odo as well, which is why he also seems persecuted. Like, there's a lot of things going on with him. And also on top of the fact that he's gender fluid and, even like identity fluid,
Well, he's sex fluid, but he literally,
and he's a fluid.
He actually very firmly identifies as male. So he's set on a gender pretty quickly, probably because he realized that it was more advantageous to present as male observing humanoids. He's just like, I'm going to be on the winning team. I'm going to make myself a light-skinned male.
Throughout the 2 episodes, there's a lot of sexist statements that have been thrown around. So especially in this world, and especially more so than in Star Trek: The Next Generation, it seems like those types of more quote unquote primitive behaviors exist more on this station. So it would make sense for him then, if he wanted power, he was like, oh, the palest, malest person is going to have power.
I love the pale male catalog.
But also he literally, when we're speaking about fluid, he can also turn into a fluid. That's how he can ooze underneath stuff, right?
Yeah. That's again, like that's why he has to be in a bucket. He is literally 2 tiers in a bucket. So what happens is the Bajorans are in Quark's bar, and they're throwing accusations at Odo and doubting him. But then Quark, for some reason, decides to defend him.
So to speed ahead, we later on find out, that there was some cloning being done, and the actual being that was murdered was a clone.
The Ibudan that was killed was not actually Ibudan himself.
Yeah. So you need to know that to make the full Casablanca reference, because Quark is Odo's enemy, which was set up in the first episode. Nobody hates Odo as much as him, but then he's also the first one to defend him, because there's some kind of weird mutual respect that Odo, he literally says, is no collaborator, which references this idea of Nazi collaborators. And on top of like the whole show kind of having like this North African vibe, right? Which is very much what Casablanca is. And then that they spend a lot of time at this bar, which is also very much like Casablanca, and that whole line about friendship with the enemy, who's also a police member.
Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
But then ultimately, there's also the cloning thing. It's like forbidden science that Cardassians were doing. It's this like parallel to Nazi eugenics, right? It's the same idea. So it all kind of connects to Nazis and fascism and eugenics and Casablanca. This show seems very much like it's going to play with those themes a lot. And in this episode, it really wasn't even subtle about it. It really was just like right on the nose. So going along with Cardassians being like Nazis, it also seems like there's another parallel, especially made poignant in this episode with the Ferengi. They seem like they're very much like American conservatives, because they, said a lot of like typical conservative reactionary statements when they were speaking to Keiko about schools and women, and also about dog-eat-dog capitalism.
A comparison modern scholars have drawn from Earth history likens the Ferengi to the ocean-going Yankee traders of 18th and 19th century America, sir.
From the history of my forebears, Yankee traders.
Who in this case sailed the galaxy in search of mercantile and territorial opportunity.
And are these scholars saying that the Ferengi may not be unlike us?
Hardly, sir. I believe the analogy refers to the worst quality of capitalists. The Ferengi are believed to conduct their affairs of commerce on the ancient principle caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware.
Yankee traders, I like the sound of that.
So this is now I'm gonna dig into some of my experience as a bona fide Trekkie. When I was at Star Trek Las Vegas this past August, I was at the Deep Space Nine panel where Armin Shimmerman was speaking, and a fan asked him about how he felt about some of the people who had concluded that like Ferengi were all like anti-Semitic tropes because large ears and bulbous noses and being these sort of money grubbing goblins. But what he said was number one, I'm Jewish. Max Grodenchik, who played Rom, is Jewish. Aaron Eisenberg, the late Aaron Eisenberg, who played Nog, is Jewish. Rick Berman, who was like the producer of the show and one of the writers, was Jewish. And none of them felt like it was meant to be anti-Semitic. That really the Ferengi, I forgot his specific words, but he was like, yeah, they're really a parody of American conservatives. I think I can't remember if he said conservatives or like right wingers or whatever, but just like, but they're definitely. I think Ira Stephen Bear, who was eventually becomes one of the main showrunners on the show in the later seasons, also specifically said it's like the Ferengi are supposed to be 20th century Americans. Like they're definitely like that is the main thing that was come to mind when they were sort of figuring out what qualities are like played up in the Ferengi. The rest of this episode, so I mean, we already talked about how it ends, but what's interesting is that like as the sort of second half of this episode plays out, the tension is that as Odo deals with being suspect for murdering a Bajoran, he is attacked in a way that is kind of seen as racial. Like he comes into his office and it's been vandalized and they spray painted the word shifter, even though he ends up, exonerating himself. It is interesting to sort of think about what this episode has to say about like police and authority and like when you are a racially marginalized person that is still given institutional power. Like it kind of feels a little bit like it's sort of like the feel sorry for black cops kind of sensibility going on there. And I wanted to see if you took away the same thing.
I think Odo, even being a shapeshifter, right, it fits that he's a confusing character. And I think they're saying a lot of things with him. But ultimately, I got the sense of like centrism in this episode. There's stuff that's very progressive about this episode, right, and about the show. But as far as like the mechanics of the show and as far as actually like the moral compass of the show, it was all about centrism. It's about like, reform and working within the system. And, there's either working within the system or there's mob justice, right? There's no such thing as revolutionary type of justice, right?
Because a literal mob of Bajorans ends up coming like for Odo before they finally reveal like where Ibudan himself has been hiding.
And what was the point of Ibudan like framing Odo? What was he ultimately trying to get out of this episode?
I guess it's just, Odo, arrested me previously, so I'm just going to frame him for murder as revenge. It's kind of a shallow, I think, justification for the grudge, because like they have this great thread of like, what do we consider Odo a collaborator because he worked under the authority of these oppressors? But like, they like you said, the centrist cop out where it's like, oh, but like the guy who raised all of these questions was also a bad man himself. So then you don't even have to contemplate the questions he raised, like Killmonger, in Black Panther. It's like, oh, because he like, he enjoyed killing people in Afghanistan and Iraq. We have license to completely ignore the legitimate questions about the legacy of imperialism and Black slavery throughout the world. So yeah, it is a bit of a cop out that it's just like, oh, revenge against the cop who busted me. when I think it would have been interesting if maybe Ibudan had a bit of a more personal grudge and like maybe a pattern of like going after collaborators. I think you said earlier about how, again, one of the many contradictions under capitalism that exists, that within Deep Space Nine, you can have these kind of progressive and then kind of pro status quo ideas, which I guess is just what is allowed to exist under the capitalist mode of production of entertainment in the United States, because you have all these great questions of, what is the role of, how do we view people who aid and abet oppressors when they are oppressed in some way themselves? But then the answers presented are cop-outs.
What's interesting, though, is in this world, even if you kill a clone, that's still considered murder.
Yeah, actually, that's one of the things that I find really interesting about this episode is how they just really uh, uh, graze against like a whole other plot about like cloning and, all of the traditional philosophical and existential questions about cloning, because it's like at the end of the episode in the captain's log, he's like, oh, the clone that it's like they grew Bashir like grows a new clone by accident out of a tissue sample that he gets from the crime scene.
He does the forbidden science.
Yeah.
To solve the crime.
But then they're like, oh, by the way, the clone has gained sentience. And it's like, what? Like, okay, so there's just like this new Ibudan who's going to be given all the same, like it's just taken for granted that he's just going to be given all the rights and privileges of a sentient being without any kind of discussion about. I mean, it is so funny how that's just like, that's reduced to I mean, I guess it's because it is done to death, like in so many other works of fiction that deal with cloning, but like just to have it be by the way, the clone's, happy living his own life in sunny Florida. It's one of the weird, mind-bogglingly like slapdash elements of this episode. Like a lot, throughout the show, like a lot of things are done with so much like thoughtfulness and consideration that it is funny to have such a big, like, just hanging thread that doesn't get picked up. Like Ibudan never comes back. This is purely a villain of the week episode. And especially viewing it from the context of somebody who's seen the whole show like me, like that part really stands out.
I think we also have to recognize that this was a show for network TV following the 20-something odd episode format. So it's a lot of episodes that they have to write. So it's not going to be as tight as like cable shows that are only 10 episodes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it gets later on as like they pick like what are some of the big like main through line stories, things start to tighten up. But especially in the first season where they're still sort of, very much like, episode of the week kind of thing. You're right. There are just things that are just kind of not everything is laid as expertly as it could be.
Now let's finish on a lighter note.
Sure.
Because there's this alien who's like an extra. Usually you think of actors as extras,
Yep.
but this time it's an alien extra that keeps popping up in this episode, in the last episode. And he's this alien that looks like a bullfrog.
His name is Morn, which is an anagram for Norm.
Oh!
Yep. He's the resident barfly, much like the one from Cheers. That was very much intentional.
So he is meant to be a mascot for this show, or the bar at least.
Yeah, he never speaks, mostly because the makeup prosthetic doesn't really have an articulated mouth, but that becomes part of the gag. But Morn is he's a very reliable gag, and you'll come to love him even more as the show goes on. We have seen, what's funny is that we have seen some Lurians, that's the name of Morn's species, appear in Star Trek Discovery now. And so it'll be interesting to see if we ever get to see what one of them looks like when their mouth is moving.
Yeah, he's already been useful in this episode to set up a couple of visual gags.
Yep. Let's end on your joyful discovery of Morn. So if you liked this episode, please support the Southpaw Network on Patreon. That's patreon.com/southpawpod. You'll not just be supporting this, but you'll be supporting the Prime Southpaw Podcast, the Fight Study, Pride Never Die, Working Stiff, a lovely community of podcasts and podcasters just looking to create content that helps uplift and liberate people. So our next episode that we will be doing, again, just to remind people, we're going in the Netflix episode order because probably more people have Netflix than Paramount Plus. So the next episode we're going to do is going to be Past Prologue. Stay tuned, and we will catch you next time on Southpaw Deep Space Nine.
No, you got to close us out with the music. Can you close us out with the music?
Yeah. Ba-na-na-na, ba-ba-na-na, ba-da-da, ba-ba-da-da, ba-da-da.